The phone had been ringing for 3 days straight. Paul Goresh stood in the narrow dark room of his Brooklyn apartment, red light washing over his hands as they trembled above the developing tray. The images were floating up through the chemicals, slow and certain, like ghosts pushing through water. He already knew what they showed. He'd been there. His camera had been there. But seeing them fixed in silver and shadow made his throat close. December 8th, 1980. Monday night. Outside the Dakota. He'd been waiting with his Pentax like he'd done dozens of times before, hoping for a shot, maybe a smile, maybe John would stop and sign something for the small crowd that always gathered. It was cold. People were stamping their feet. Someone had a radio playing. Normal. Just another night of waiting. And then it wasn't. The prints were drying now on the line above him, clips holding them like evidence. The images showed the before. John signing an album for a man in a long coat. John's face, patient, almost tired. The man's hand reaching out. The moment captured in available light, grainy but clear. Paul had taken 12 frames. Professional instinct, good composition. The kind of candid celebrity shot that usually earned a few $100s from a wire service. Except the man in the long coat had come back 4 hours later with a gun. Paul hadn't been there for that part. He'd gone home. He'd missed the sirens, the blood, the crowd gathering in shock. He learned about it the way millions of others did, from the radio, from the sudden impossible announcement that cut through every station. John Lennon had been shot. John Lennon was dead. He'd thrown up in his kitchen sink. Now the phone rang again. Paul ignored it. He'd been ignoring it since Tuesday morning when the first call came from a wire service, then a newspaper, then a magazine, then people he'd never heard of, voices tight with urgency, all asking the same question. Do you have photos from Monday night? The ones from before? We'll pay. We need them. Name your price. He'd hung up each time without answering. But they kept calling, and the offers kept rising. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, dim even with the lights on. Paul lived alone, 42 years old. He'd been a photographer for 18 years, freelance, scraping by on concert shots and celebrity candids, selling to whoever would buy. Some mounts were good. Most were tight. He owed 2 months' rent. His car needed work. His camera equipment was aging. He wasn't starving, but he was always calculating, always watching the line between making it and not making it. And now, pinned to a clothesline in his darkroom, he had 12 photographs worth more money than he'd ever imagined. A knock came at the door. Firm, insistent. Paul dried his hands and walked through the narrow hallway. He looked through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, mid-50s, gray suit, leather briefcase, patient expression. Not a reporter. Something else. Paul opened the door partway. Mr. Garsh, the man said. His voice was calm, businesslike. My name is Richard Stanton. I'm a private collector. May I come in? I'm not selling. I understand. I'd still like to talk. Just 5 minutes. Paul hesitated, then stepped back. The man entered, glancing around the small apartment with the practiced neutrality of someone used to reading people through their surroundings. He didn't sit. He set the briefcase on the kitchen table and opened it. I won't waste your time, Stanton said. I know you've been getting calls. I know what you have. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the negatives and old prints. Exclusive rights. The photos would be kept private, not published, not exploited, just preserved. Paul said nothing. Stanton pulled out a checkbook. I can write the check now. You'd have the money tomorrow. Why do you want them if you're not going to publish them? Because they're the last photographs of John Lennon alive and at peace. They're history. They matter. And because if you don't sell them to someone like me, you'll sell them to someone who will turn them into spectacle. Stanton's eyes were steady, not unkind. He wasn't lying. There was no malice in him. He believed what he was saying. He believed he was offering dignity, Protection, a way to preserve something sacred, while also solving Paul's very real financial problems. I'll think about it, Paul said quietly. The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, I can't guarantee the price. Stanton closed the briefcase. Other people are coming. They'll offer more, or less. But they won't offer discretion. He left his card on the table and walked out. Paul stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. $50,000. Enough to pay off his debts, buy new equipment, stop worrying for a year, maybe two. Enough to breathe. He went back to the darkroom. The prints were dry now. He took them down carefully and spread them across the small table under the red light. 12 images. John's face in different moments. The signature happening. The man in the coat, his face visible, clear, identifiable. The crowd in the background, the Dakota's facade, the ordinariness of it all. The next day, the phone calls multiplied. A magazine editor offered $75,000. A British newspaper offered $100. A tabloid offered $150. Voice slick with excitement, promising front page, international syndication, historic documentation. They used words like duty to history and public interest in capturing the final moments. Paul stopped answering. He unplugged the phone. But they found him anyway. A woman from a major news network appeared at his door Thursday afternoon. She was younger than Paul, maybe 30, sharp-eyed and intense. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mr. Goresh, I'm Emma Reeves, photo editor for. I know who you are. Then you know we're serious. We're prepared to offer $200,000 for exclusive first publication rights. You'd retain the negatives. We'd handle everything professionally, with dignity. The world needs to see these photos. They're part of the historical record. John would want people to know the truth of his last hours. Paul leaned against the doorframe. You didn't know John. No. But I know what journalism means. I know that hiding these photos doesn't protect him. It erases him. It lets everyone else tell the story except the person who was actually there. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't manipulative. She believed what she was saying. In her world, in her profession, this made sense. Documentation mattered. Truth mattered. The public had a right to see, to know, to witness. And $200,000 was fair compensation for that truth. I need time, Paul said. We go to print Sunday. That's 3 days. The offer expires Saturday at noon. She handed him a folder with contract terms and walked away. Paul closed the door and sat at his kitchen table. The folder lay unopened in front of him. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Traffic, voices, sirens in the distance, life continuing while somewhere, in a hospital, then in an apartment, then in arrangements being made. John's absence was growing into something the world couldn't yet measure. Friday morning, Paul's landlord knocked. I heard, the landlord said. He was an older man, Greek, stern but not cruel. About the photos, about the offers. Paul said nothing. You owe rent. 2 months. I've been patient. I know. You could pay it now. You could pay it. And have plenty left. Paul nodded slowly. The landlord looked at him for a long moment. My son died 3 years ago. Car accident. Someone took photos at the scene. Police photos. A lawyer got them. Used them in a trial. I saw them. I saw my son like that. Broken, gone, and I. He stopped. His jaw worked. You do what you need to do. But those photos, once they're out, they don't go back. They live forever. John's wife, his children, they'll see them. Everyone will see them. You decide if that's right. He left without waiting for an answer. Paul stood in his apartment surrounded by silence. The folder from the news network sat on the table. Stanton's card was there too. The phone, still unplugged, held messages he hadn't checked. The world was pressing in, asking, demanding, offering, needing. He went to the darkroom and looked at the prints again. John's face, tired but patient, signing the album. The man in the coat, whose name everyone knew now, whose face was everywhere, whose act had broken something in the world. And Paul's camera had caught it all. The last quiet moment before violence, the threshold between life and absence. He thought about the money. He thought about his rent, his car, his aging mother who needed help, his own future that felt increasingly uncertain. He thought about what $200,000 meant for someone like him, someone who'd spent his whole adult life hustling for the next paycheck. Then he thought about John's children. 5-year-old Sean, Julian, older, already carrying wounds, Yoko, grieving in ways Paul couldn't imagine. He thought about them sitting somewhere, trying to process the impossible, and then seeing these photos, their father's last peaceful moments turned into commodity, into content, into something owned and distributed, and consumed by strangers. He thought about being the person who did that to them. Saturday morning, Paul made his decision. He took the negatives and all the prints and put them in a fireproof box. He locked it. Then he called Stanton and told him no. He called the news network and told them no. He unplugged the phone again and sat in the quiet of his apartment while the deadline passed. The offers didn't stop. Over the next weeks, they rose. 500,000. 1 million. Representatives from museums, from private collectors, from international media outlets. They called his friends, his family, left messages with neighbors. They found him on the street. They sent letters. They promised anything he wanted. Paul said no to all of them. His landlord evicted him in January. Paul moved to a smaller place, a studio in a worse neighborhood. He sold some of his camera equipment to survive. He took whatever photo work he could find, weddings and school portraits and small commercial jobs. The work was thin. The money was tighter than it had ever been. People who knew him asked why. Friends, family, other photographers who understood the value of what he held. They asked with genuine confusion, with concern, with frustration. Why would you turn down that money? Why would you suffer when you don't have to? What's the point? Paul never had a good answer. Or maybe he had too many answers and none of them sounded right out loud. He tried to explain once, to a friend over beer in a dim bar, about dignity and grief, and the difference between documentation and desecration. But the words had come out clumsy and incomplete, and his friend had just shaken his head, unable to understand. The months turned into years. The offers diminished but never stopped completely. Every few years, someone new would emerge. A collector or institution or media company, armed with fresh numbers and fresh arguments. The value only increased. 5 million. 10 million. Estimates that the prints would be worth 50 million at auction. Maybe more, the last photographs of a cultural icon in his final hours of peace. Paul kept them locked away. He never looked at them again after that Saturday when he'd made his choice. The fireproof box stayed sealed, stored in a safe deposit box at a bank he could barely afford. Sometimes he thought about them, about what they showed, about the moment his camera had captured. But he never opened the box. His life got smaller. He worked. He paid rent. He aged. The photography industry changed around him, went digital, went online, and he adapted as best he could, but always from the margins, always scraping, always one bad month away from crisis. People forgot about him eventually. The story of the photographer who'd been there that night, who'd taken the last photos and refused to sell them, became a minor footnote, a strange anecdote shared occasionally in articles about celebrity photography ethics or debates about privacy and public interest. Paul didn't mind being forgotten. In 2005, walking past the Dakota on a cold December evening, 25 years after that night, Paul stopped. The building looked the same. The entrance where John had signed the album, where he'd smiled patiently at fans, where he'd walked toward the door and into the last 4 hours of his life, was unchanged. A few people stood on the sidewalk. Tourists, probably. Someone had left flowers. a small memorial that never fully went away. Paul stood there for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, breath visible in the winter air. He thought about the photos locked in the box. He thought about what they'd be worth now, what they represented. He thought about the life he might have had if he'd sold them. The comfort, the security, the freedom from constant financial worry. Then he thought about John Lennon, now 30 years old, living his own life, carrying his father's legacy and absence. He thought about Julian, about Yoko, about all the people who'd loved John and lost him, and had to live in a world that never stopped consuming his image, his music, his death. And Paul thought about the choice he'd made, to let one small piece of that night remain private, protected, unsold. He didn't know if it mattered. He didn't know if anyone even remembered or cared. The world had moved on. John's death had become history, analyzed and discussed and documented in 1,000 other ways. Paul's 12 photographs, locked away and unseen, probably didn't change anything in the grand scope of things. But standing there in the cold, looking at the building where it had happened, Paul felt something he couldn't quite name. Not pride, exactly. Not righteousness. Something quieter than that. Something that lived in the space between what you could do and what you chose not to do. Between the value of things and the value of silence. He walked away slowly, hands still in his pockets. Another anonymous figure on a New York street in winter. The photographs stayed locked in their box. Years later, when Paul died, his will specified that the negatives and prints were to be destroyed, unviewed, unpublished. The executive followed the instructions. The fireproof box was opened in the presence of a lawyer, the contents verified, and then everything was burned. No one would ever see those 12 images. The last photographs of John Lennon at peace, signing an album on a December night outside the Dakota, patient and tired and 4 hours away from violence, existed only in Paul Garsh's memory now. And when he died, they existed nowhere at all. $50 million, burned to ash. Some people called it waste. Others called it principle. Most people didn't call it anything because they'd never heard the story, or they'd forgotten it, or it had never seemed important enough to remember. But somewhere in the arithmetic of what we choose to preserve and what we choose to protect, in the space between profit and privacy, between documentation and dignity, Paul Goresh had drawn a line. He'd lived on the wrong side of that line, financially speaking, for the rest of his life. But the line had held. And in the end, that was all he'd wanted. Not to be remembered. Not to be praised. Just to keep one small moment sacred. One last piece of peace before the violence came. One fragment of John's humanity that would never be commodified or consumed or turned into content for strangers. The world had everything else. It didn't need those 12 photographs. Paul had decided that on a Saturday morning in December 1980, sitting in his small apartment with the weight of the choice pressing down on him, and he'd never looked back. The box had stayed locked. The photos had stayed hidden. The moment had stayed his alone, until even that was gone, released into smoke. Returned to the air above a city that had long since moved on to other tragedies, other losses, other impossible mornings, when the music stopped, and someone had to decide what to do with the images of the silence that came after. Paul Goresh chose to let it stay silent. The world got smaller because of it, or maybe, in some way that couldn't be measured in dollars or documentation, it stayed a little bit larger. A little bit more human, because some things remained unseen.